Fox Studios in New York City, this is Maria Bartiromo's Wall Street.
And happy weekend to all. Welcome to the program that analyzes the week that was and helps position you for the week ahead. I'm Maria Bartiromo. Thanks for joining us. Police moving in to crack down on violent anti-Israel protests raging on college campuses across the country. More than 2,000 arrests have been made across 46 campuses in 24 different states. The Senate now considering a vote on the House anti-Semitism bill targeting the Education Department and pushing the enforcement of federal anti-discrimination laws. Republican senators also pushing to cut billions of dollars in federal funding away from universities who have seemingly placated violent anti-Israel demonstrators on their campuses. Watch.
There is a rot in the universities right now. Let's take back all the money that we can.
Why would we give them our tax dollars when they hate Jews and they hate Israel?
We're taking a look at how to condition that money.
We need to give the resources necessary to do the investigations. Then they may see their funding cut.
Joining me right now from the Senate Appropriations Committee is Senator Bill Hagerty. Senator, great to have you this weekend. Thank you for being here.
It's always good to be with you, Maria. Thank you.
Is this going to move forward, taking funding away from these universities? How will you decide who gets what?
Well, we just passed through a massive appropriations package. We'll be looking at the next set right away. In fact, it's coming up over the course of the next several weeks. This is a top-of-mind issue for most of the senators. It's even a bipartisan concern. We've got to address this. The campuses have really just let things run wild. And, Maria, it seems like this happens every presidential election year. You get you think about the Occupy Wall Street protests that took place back in 2012. You think about the BLM riots. Now we've got all of this. The college campuses have become a hotbed of discriminatory behavior, of violence. You've seen all the arrests. The American public are deeply concerned about it. Certainly those of us in the Senate are concerned about it too. And I think it's a manifestation of this, quote, DEI initiative that's gone way over the top. Now they've got these young people being indoctrinated in terms of this notion of someone's either oppressed or an oppressor. They're not asking what's happened. They're not asking what's behind all of this. They don't even seem to acknowledge the fact that October the 7th took place, the horrors that took place there. Instead, they're calling for genocide and threatening students on their own campus, and these college campuses are just becoming an area of violence and threatening behavior. It's got to come to an end. That's why you've seen the frustration coming from the Senate.
I'm trying to understand who specifically is behind this. The Wall Street Journal had an op-ed this week, Rules for Campus Radicals 2024, and they mentioned this website, crimethinc.com, a website that has become a hub for anarchists and Antifa activists and radical leftists. Recently, they published anonymous reports from around the country drawing lessons from various campus protests. They reveal methods behind the mayhem, and they tell people to occupy spaces where the classes are held and take over buildings. Who's behind it?
We need to get to the bottom of who's funding all of this. There's clearly a supply chain that's being supported. You look at the tents that are coming out, you see these people moving onto campuses. This is organized in some fashion. It's deeply concerning. I put forward legislation to stop foreign investors from coming in and affecting our elections here. Hans-Georg Wyss, a Swiss billionaire, is well known to come in and try to affect the outcome of elections here. This is very much part and parcel of the type of activity that these sorts of people are foaming and supporting and funding. We should absolutely get to the bottom of it because it's completely destroying the sense of safety on our campuses. This is not what parents are paying for. This is not what students deserve.
Well, your colleague, Senator Tom Cotton, announced a new bill that would stop any student who has been convicted of a crime during these anti-Israel protests from having their student loans forgiven. Do you support that?
Absolutely. This student loan forgiveness exercise, as you know, is going to fail in courts. It has continued to fail in courts. But our federal Department of Education has completely failed America. They spend all their time on this. They can't get student loan, they can't get financial aid applications even processed. Parents don't know what to do this year because of the ineptitude of the federal Department of Education. And now the federal Department of Education is not doing anything about the civil rights violations that are taking place in these campuses that they're theoretically supporting and overseeing. It's a grotesque failure. Tom is exactly right. We need to put supervision in place. We need to put consequences in place.
Meanwhile, Iranian state TV is reporting that Shiraz University in Iran is now offering free tuition to U.S. students who've been expelled over the anti-Israel protests. Shiraz University inviting U.S. professors also to continue their work there as well. Our adversaries are cheering on these protests, Senator, and to think that somebody is going to say, well, I was expelled from, Colombia, I think I'll go move to Iran and go to Shiraz University. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it underscores the fact that Iran is actually behind all of this. You recall in President Trump's administration, we imposed maximum pressure on Iran. We squeezed their reserve accounts down to below $8 billion. Hamas and Hezbollah had been completely defunded. President Trump was able to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Against all the predictions, there was no war. We took out Soleimani. There was no war. What we saw was peace breaking out in the Middle East. As soon as Joe Biden comes into office, he again enriches Iran, stops imposing the sanctions immediately. And what we have right now is a direct byproduct of that. Joe Biden should be looking in the mirror right now and asking him why what's happening on these campuses, why what happened on October the 7th is happening, and he needs to look no further than his own policies.
And meanwhile, you've signed on to a letter with nearly 36 other Republican senators demanding that Joe Biden stop this proposal to bring Palestinian refugees from Gaza into America. The letter highlights national security risks with, quote, vetting this high-risk population for terrorist ties to Hamas. But the White House is pushing forward, assuring that they're taking the process, quote, very, very seriously. Do you think that the White House is going to move Palestinians from Gaza into America? Wouldn't that send a message to these anti-Israel protesters that they won, they got what they wanted, even though they caused all this chaos this week?
I think it very clearly is a concession to these protesters. This is about the politics of the American election in 2024. We're talking about Minnesota. We're talking about Michigan. We're talking about those states that Joe Biden needs to win the presidency, and he's doing a massive appeasement exercise. He certainly isn't talking about the Americans that are still held hostage in Gaza. They're doing nothing to get rid of, to address that situation in the open. But here we are. $3.5 billion was put in this last massive supplemental package that just passed the Senate. They didn't mention this up until the day the Senate passed it, and then immediately talked about opening 2 new offices, one of them in Turkey, one in Egypt. These offices are going to be used to process Palestinians from Gaza into America. Now, let me ask you this. In the recent polling, 70% of Gazans support the October 7th attacks. We're not supposed to be bringing people into this country that support terror or have been involved in it. Yet this White House and this State Department somehow is going to be competent enough to vet this when we can't even protect our own southern border. I think Americans should be deeply concerned. I certainly am.
All right, we will leave it there. Senator, we are watching your work as usual. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Maria. Great to be with you this weekend.
Right. Senator Bill Hagerty. Meanwhile, Janet Yellen gets political. What the Treasury Secretary says about another Trump presidency and what it could mean for the Fed and the economy. Grant's Interest Rate Observer founder and editor Jim Grant is weighing in on that and more next. Well, welcome back. Here's a look at where markets ended the week after Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell said more rate hikes are unlikely. This after the April jobs report showed far fewer jobs added to the economy than expected. The unemployment rate ticked higher to 3.9%, while February and March revisions showed 22,000 fewer jobs added than previously reported. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary and former head of the Federal Reserve Janet Yellen getting political in the battleground state of Arizona on Friday, making thinly veiled warnings that another Donald Trump presidency would be a threat to our democracy and economic growth, referencing the January 6th riot and pressing the importance of a politically independent Federal Reserve. Joining me now is Grant's Interest Rate Observer founder and editor, Jim Grant. And Jim, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for being here this weekend.
You are entirely welcome, Maria. Wouldn't be any place else.
There was that article in the Journal the other day saying, oh, Trump's allies are planning this big restructuring of the Federal Reserve. Meanwhile, it's President Joe Biden who gave a speech the other day and said, we're going to get an interest rate cut and it's going to be a month delayed. I mean, did he speak with Jay Powell? Is he messaging to Jay Powell to cut interest rates? I mean, talk about, not having the independence of the Federal Reserve. We've got a sitting president telling us that an interest rate cut is going to be delayed by a month. But,
right.
Oftentimes, go ahead.
He is, Joe Biden, speaking in the long tradition of Presidents Johnson and Nixon and Roosevelt, FDR, and Truman, of course. I don't think there's much new here, except the reaction, perhaps, on the part of Janet Yellen. What is a little bit new, Maria, is the dependence of the Federal Reserve on On the Treasury Department, the Fed, as we would say in the private sector, is broke. Now, this sounds like a provocative word, and it's certainly a disturbing one. But every week, the Fed reports its own finances. The form is called the H41 form. And it shows that the Fed has got a witness will now consult his notes. The Fed is $123.6 billion in the hole to the Treasury. It's borrowed that much against its mounting operating losses. It pays out 5.5 or so, and it earns 2% to 3%. So that's no way to get rich, and the Fed is duly losing money, a lot of money. So the Fed shows negative capital.
It's a really important point that you make, and I appreciate you making it. Jim, I want to get your take on the macro story. On Friday, we got the jobs numbers, weaker than expected. That sparks a rally in stocks, as I guess we're back to believing that the Fed is going to cut interest rates at some point. How do you see things, Jim?
Well, I think the Fed dearly wants to cut interest rates. The legacy of a dozen years of 0% or so rates, the legacy of the era of money growing on trees has been one important consequence of that has been an enormous buildup of debt, both in business and in government. And what business and government don't need is higher rates of interest. However, if the Fed means to protect the integrity of the dollar, that is to say, it means to hold down the rate of inflation, it has to address that with higher rates. That's kind of what it has. It's a tool it has. So everyone's hoping and praying for lower rates and exhaling mightily when they seem to be getting them.
Do you think there's still a chance we see a recession in the second half? Nancy Lazar from Piper Sandler is telling clients she's sticking to her base case that we see an economy in recession in the second half because things are slowing and are not all that good when you actually peel back the onion. And she's also saying that that will send unemployment up above 4%. Your thoughts?
Well, Nancy is one to agree with rather than to disagree with, so that's view is to be respected. You never know. Yeah, I mean, I have expected a recession for the following reasons. I've expected one because the yield curve is negatively sloped, meaning that high rates are higher than long ones. Short rates are higher than long ones. Money supply growth had tailed off dramatically. But lo and behold, the long anticipated recession has never yet materialized. But Nancy is certainly on point that there is a strong possibility.
Okay, we will leave it there. Jim Grant, always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria.
Okay, good to see you. Jim Grant is the founder of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. We are following the money. Who's funding the chaos on campus? An investigative reporter was on a call with the organizers of the Columbia protests just hours before they began. What he learned about the nonprofit group promoting anti-Israel protests. The NYPD now releasing body cam footage of officers arresting anti-Israel protesters who had barricaded themselves inside Columbia University's Hamilton Hall on Tuesday night. We're now learning about the group that helped coordinate the chaos. The People's Forum is a registered charity with operations made possible by millions of dollars in donations. They held a meeting in Manhattan just hours before the demonstration. Washington Free Beacon senior investigative reporter Joe Simonson sat in on that meeting over Zoom, and he joins us right now. Joe, great to have you. Thanks very much for being here. Can you tell us a little about what you heard, what you learned from that Zoom?
Thank you for having me. Absolutely. So during the meeting, which lasted about 2.5 hours, you had senior employees of the People's Forum, which is, as you said, a self-described Marxist group funded by left-wing millionaires, held a planning session both for May Day protests and also for escalating the Columbia protests. And essentially what the organizers of the meeting said is that we want to recreate, and I'm quoting them, recreate the summer of 2020. And that was met with cheers and claps. After those individuals spoke, the attendees broke into separate meeting groups and talked about how to, again, escalate these protests against Israel. Hours later, and a lot of these attendees had just come from Colombia, hours later, they were back at Colombia, and that's when the protests got much more serious. As you mentioned, illegally occupying this building, and as one janitor said, was holding one of them hostage.
Exactly. Yeah, that was incredible. Now, the People's Forum is made possible through donations, and you have reported that the group's operations are made possible in large part by a $12 million donation from Goldman Sachs' charitable arm. Tell me about that.
Exactly. Now, Goldman wants to be very clear that this is none of their money. This is simply a client-directed fund, except it's run by Goldman Sachs. The Goldman Sachs employees basically do the day-to-day operations to keep it up. But that's exactly right. This individual named Neville Singham likely directed that $12 million donation to the People's Forum in 2019. And that $12 million donation was the largest single donation that the Goldman Sachs Philanthropy Fund gave that year. And Goldman Sachs gets really upset when you mention this fact because they pretend that they had no choice, that if any client wants to donate money to any group, they're happy to oblige. Now, I personally find that defense kind of risible.
Well, you also reported that Singham is an American businessman who lives in China. And he reportedly helps finance the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda worldwide. Tell me about the CCP connection here.
Absolutely. Neville Singham, he's a very wealthy individual who moved to China. He calls himself a Maoist. His wife, if your viewers are familiar with the group Code Pink, which is this far-left anti-war organization that also defends China. And so the New York Times has covered this individual. Other outlets have covered this individual. This man is proud to work with the CCP. He attends CCP meetings, and he funds a number of left-wing organizations in the United States, including the People's Forum, that this isn't just a normal anti-Israel group. This is a group that, after the October 7th attacks in Israel, if you remember, in Times Square the next day, there were people celebrating these attacks and celebrating Hamas. There's an individual there waving a swastika around. That protest in Times Square that was so horrifying was organized by the People's Forum, which again is funded by this individual, Neville Singham, who lives in China. What's disturbing is that you have a wealthy American businessman subsidizing the Chinese government's propaganda. Again, this is an organization that wants to overthrow our country, and the worst part of it is that he gets a tax break. He funds this and gets to write it off on his taxes. He gets to donate millions and millions of dollars to a group that calls for a revolution, which is in itself a violation of the IRS code, and essentially the rest of the country gets to subsidize it. He pays less taxes to do the Chinese Communist Party's bidding.
Well, that's incredible to me. I mean, I call this the philanthropy scam, and it's not the only way that it's a scam, but you have these groups that claim that they are philanthropies, and then they're actually sending their money to political ideas and then getting tax breaks.
That's exactly right, and this is a huge problem within the nonprofit structure of our tax code, and the IRS just has no interest in enforcing this at all. All these groups that are shutting down bridges, that are occupying college campuses, that are engaged in violent anti-Israel protests or protests that are meant to disrupt commerce, virtually all of the groups behind it are charities. That's what they're called. They're charities, just like the Red Cross. And the IRS, again, is clear. You cannot be encouraging or organizing lawbreaking. You can't even have members at your events who are doing lawbreaking. The IRS is plainly clear that your charity status should be revoked, but the IRS is nowhere to be found on this. And that's one of the most frustrating aspects of all of this. These groups, these millionaires and billionaires get to donate to these groups and write it off, and we have to deal with the consequences.
That is incredible. Joseph, we so appreciate your time this weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be watching your work, Joseph Simonson. I've got one important thing you need to know ahead of next week, and that's next. Welcome back. One thing you need to know about ahead of next week, consumers are gearing up for brand new Apple products as the technology giant holds its Let Loose event on Tuesday. Rumors swirling about product announcements to come. An updated iPad widely expected after no new models were released last year. The event comes after Apple revealed a decline in second quarter revenue this week with a decline in iPhone sales of better than 10%. We'll be following it all on Mornings with Maria. Join us weekdays 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern right here on Fox Business. And I'll see you over on the Fox News channel this Sunday, 10 a.m. Eastern live for Sunday Morning Futures. I've got exclusive interviews with Congresswoman Elise Stefanik from New York, RNC co-chair Lara Trump, former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, and former NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly. Join us live Sunday, 10 a.m. Eastern on Fox News channel. And that'll do it for us here on Fox Business. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of the weekend, and I'll see you again next time.